Welcome to Close Listening. I'm Zach Morgenstern, joined as always by silent co-host Ludwig von B. And today we are talking about Peter Criss, the Kiss solo album. So in 1978, as the members of Kiss were feuding, the group elected to simultaneously release 4 solo albums. I stumbled upon Ace Frehley's album by accident a few years ago, and more recently listened to Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons' records. Yet today I sit before you reviewing the least acclaimed of the 4 projects, the one done by drummer Peter Criss. So Criss was Kiss's original drummer, but he was also blessed with a voice that was eerily similar to Rod Stewart. In fact, years ago when I first put on a Kiss Greatest Hits album, the song Hard Luck Woman started playing, and I had to look up whether Rod Stewart had ever been a member of Kiss. Criss was also known for singing and co-writing Beth, which was Kiss's biggest American hit, which is pretty ironic given the fact that Criss, was in constant feuds with Kiss's leaders, Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, and the fact that none of the other Kiss people even play on that song. It's just Peter Criss and an orchestra. So anyway, when it came time to make solo records, Criss's song selection deviated most from what a typical Kiss album would sound like. When people say this about the record, when they say they're disappointed that it does not sound like a Kiss album, I find that criticism to be a little overblown. Firstly, because there's all kinds of inconsistencies throughout the Kiss catalog. So if you listen to the Gene Simmons solo album, even, it includes a lot of orchestration and even a very memorable cover at the end, Jiminy Cricket's When You Wish Upon a Star. But secondly, Peter Criss's success with Kiss thus far had been with songs that already broke with the Kiss formula, as I said, Beth and Hard Luck Woman. So if anything, it makes sense that if you're having 4 solo albums to represent the 4 elements of Kiss, Criss's work would continue to go in that softer, more ballad-oriented direction. Anyway, introduction out of the way, let's talk about the tracks on this record. So 6 of these songs were credited to Criss, who wrote with a co-writer named Stan Penridge, but there's also a cover song on here, as well as songs written for him by various associated writers, such as road manager Sean Delaney and Vinnie Poncia, who would go on to produce the Dynasty album for Kiss. So track 1 in this record is I'm Gonna Love You. The full lyric is I'm gonna love you, come rain or shine, which nicely mirrors the closing track, which is called I Can't Stop the Rain. So there's some nice symmetry there. This song really takes advantage of Peter Criss's Rod Stewart sound. It's an upbeat blues rocker. It sounds like the kind of thing Rod Stewart would record with some sort of garish horns accenting Criss's raspy voice. And the chorus also makes a brief interlude into a minor key. So it's a poppy song, but it's a tiny bit out there, a tiny bit experimental. Now, unfortunately, the problem with a lot of these songs is that lyrically, they're not very interesting. Now, obviously, you can have a hit song without brilliant lyrics, but, it has to be that magical combination of simple but catchy lyrics with catchy music. And all this stuff to me is pretty good. It's just nothing quite sticks with you, and the lyrics don't do any of the legwork. It's all on Criss's voice and the sound of the music. Anyway, track 2 is called You Matter to Me, and this one is a nice change in tone. It's more synth heavy, so if we heard with track 1 the bluesier side of Rod Stewart, this is more the Do You Think I'm Sexy era side of Rod Stewart. And again, nothing good about the lyrics, but I appreciate the drama in the performance that goes into a line like, look up, the sky is crying endless tears. Track 3 is the catchiest on here, but unfortunately, it's the one that's a cover of an established hit. It's a slightly modernized version of a song from the early 60s called Tossing and Turning. And this one shows what it takes to write a successful lyric. You don't need to be brilliant, but you need to come up with some sort of turn of phrase. You can't simply string together sentences about love. There has to be some minimal element of wordplay in there, but once you have that, the words roll off your tongue and sentences become music. Track number 4 is called Don't You Let Me Down. This one sounds a bit like Lionel Richie, though he didn't have a solo career yet, so it may just be a coincidence. Again, the lyrics don't do much, but the soft reverb of those electric keys and the melodramatic sobbing quality in Chris's voice make it a strong song. And to give credit, the lyrics do have a bit of wordplay in here. Try to keep my chin up, feel I'm falling farther down. So I'll skip over track 5, but track 6 is sonically very interesting. So Chris clearly had a knack for copying legendary British singers, as here he sounds less like Rod Stewart and more like early David Bowie. Unfortunately, the lyrics do not have the charisma of David Bowie. These might be the most minimal lyrics on the album, so it sounds like you have Ziggy Stardust singing Rock and Roll Suicide, but all he's doing is repeating a few phrases about love. Skip over track 7. Track 8, Kiss the Girl Goodbye, gives us some more interesting sound. It's a very breathy falsetto performance. Kind of makes me think of John Denver singing Fly Away. And then track number 9 is called On Rock and Roll. Nothing too unique about it, but it's a catchy, big rocker that keeps you listening. There's a lyric in there about getting vaccinated with a Victrola needle. That's unfortunately not a very smooth lyric. It doesn't flow off the tongue very well, but in its awkwardness, there's a kind of charisma to it. And then finally, we have track 10, which is a full-on string-heavy singer-songwriter ballad that, as I said, is called I Can't Stop the Rain. The title is a nice metaphor. It suggests that so much in the world is caused by bigger forces than us, acts of God, if you will. Yet we insist on blaming one another. We insist on blaming the little people rather than realizing that sometimes life can be tough and maybe blame isn't always worth it. So anyway, that's my general impression of this album. There's nothing great, but there's a lot that's good. And it's funny that I was listening to this at the same time as I was listening to an audiobook of Paul Stanley's autobiography, Face the Music. And if you do plan on reading that, I would suggest the audiobook because Stanley reads it himself, which is fitting for an autobiography. Anyway, according to Paul Stanley, his dream was to have a band like the Beatles, a band where everyone had a personality, where everyone could take their turn in the spotlight. A band that did great work together, where the fans loved all four guys, and there could be some differences, but the four guys more or less loved each other. But according to Stanley, that dream was pretty much doomed from day one. And it was, I guess, because he wanted the dream a bit too much, he didn't necessarily spend that long thinking about whether the lead guitarist and drummer that he and Gene Simmons recruited actually had that kind of compatibility with them to form a lasting band bond. And both Ace Frehley and Peter Criss were drug users, and while Stanley is certainly not kind to Ace in his autobiography, he does sort of suggest that when Ace was not on drugs, he was fun to be around and he was a good guitar player, whereas he has far fewer kind words for Peter Criss. Now, I liked Paul Stanley's book. He does a good job of framing his life into a narrative. He focuses on the trauma of being born essentially without an ear. And he also talks about the tension of reconciling the vision for a band he wanted, that fantasy recreation of the Beatles, with the actual band he ended up getting. The autobiography's third act thus gets to begin with a moment in the 90s when Stanley and Gene Simmons went so far as to fire two bandmates they really liked, drummer Eric Singer and guitarist Bruce Kulick, to try and bring Ace and Peter back into the fold. And even though Paul Stanley really liked Eric Singer as a drummer and Bruce Kulick as a guitar player, the fantasy of having his original Fab Four together was just too tempting for him.
This was the case despite his issues with Chris's personality, as well as his suggestion that Chris's drumming and songwriting talents were always dubious and had gotten even worse when they tried to reunite in the 90s.
Now, I don't know the truth, and not being a drummer, I don't really have the qualifications to sort of judge Peter Criss's musicianship as a drummer. I obviously don't know the details about behind the scenes, how much he was involved in his own songwriting, etc. So I won't assume too strongly about truth. I'll just think about this as art and narrative. So I guess what I'm saying is it's interesting to listen to this record while hearing Stanley's criticism of Peter Criss in the background. And look, when I hear the lyrics on this, I kind of see Paul Stanley's point. The lyrics are a bit lacking, and that's what keeps the songs on the Peter Criss solo album from being memorable. But if one puts the lyrics aside, this is an enjoyable record. It doesn't sound much like a Kiss record, but why does it have to? You have four different solo albums. Shouldn't they each have their own feel? And the Beatles, who Paul Stanley clearly so admired, they had so many different musical sounds. Anyway, not knowing him personally, I can't really speak to who Peter Criss, the person, is and was, or Paul Stanley is and was, but I like a lot of the music that both of them made, and listening to this album with that story in the background makes for an interesting experience. So, anyway, let me know what you think of the Peter Criss solo album or any of the other Kiss solo albums or anything related to this conversation. I'm Zach Morgenstern. This is Ludwig von B. See you next time.